We are live now, and action. Okay, guys, so today we're going to talk about the server-side validation with the usage of Fluent Validation, right? And the topics we're going to discuss today are basically here on this slide. So the first topic is the basic configuration. We're going to see how to configure the Fluent validation. We're going to look at the dependency injection, and we will make a small, simple smoke test in order to just look how the whole process is being built, right? How to configure the Fluent validation and how it works. Okay, so the next topic we will discuss is the conditions, how we can use conditions in order to control the flow of the validators. So the third topic is basically the customization, and here the huge value of the Fluent validation goes, right? So the subtopics of the customization is how can we reuse the validators, how we can nest one validator inside of another. Next, we're going to discuss the rule sets. We can define a chunk of rules, chunk of validators, and within our action methods, we can decide which chunk of the rule set we are going to use, right? So we can specify them. The next topic is going to be the specification of the properties that we're going to validate. So say we have a validator that has a lot of rules for a lot of properties, for the properties of the whole model, but we want to validate only the specific property of the validator. So say we don't need all the rules for the whole model. We want only the model ID to be checked, or we want to check only the model ID and let's say the customer name, right? All the other properties we're not interested in. So we can specify what properties we want to validate. The next topic is going to be the cascade settings. And the idea behind the cascade settings is that we can decide when we are sending the error message, right? So by default, we're getting all of the errors from all of the rules from our validator, from all of our validators. So we can set up whether we want to get the first error of the rule, whether we want to get all of the errors of the first rule within the validator, and we do not care about the other rules, right? So it's basically the customization, but it is easier to understand on the code example, which are we going to look at it together today. Okay, so basically you can, using this cascade settings, you can implement the fail fast strategy. So you can set up the validator such that it will send back to the front end the first error it's going to produce, right? So if the validation, if one of the validators fails, it sends the immediate response that the validation didn't pass and we get the error, right? So it's this behavior is also configurable. Okay, so the next topic is going to be the asynchronous validators. So say we want to check whether whether such customer already present in our database requests are asynchronous. So we can use special methods to make those asynchronous calls to the database, right? The next topic is going to be the localization. We will see at the localization of the errors that is present like by default in the Fluent validator. So there are a number of languages provided by the Fluent validation for the default errors, and we're going to look at how we can configure ASP.NET localization to use it with the Fluent validator. Okay, so the next topic is going to be unit testing. And this is basically, well, the last but not least topic. Basically, this is maybe this is the second most benefit from using the Fluent Validator, because, well, since we're going to use dependency injection for our validators, we can unit test the validators themselves, and we can unit test the controllers, or, well, other classes where we are injecting those validators, right? Because using the attribute validators, you cannot inject them, you cannot unit test them, you cannot use unit testing for them. Okay, we're going to look at the code examples. We're going to like make actual experiments. We're going to launch the code, send the request to the backend. So all those examples are going to be present in the solution. You can find this solution on the GitHub. There is a link on this post down there, and there's a huge QR code image, so you can check it out. And the repository is going to the repository includes the configuration file for the Postman, so you can easily get this configuration, and you can check out yourself those requests and how the backend works. All right. So there's another thing I want to mention, is the topics we're not going to discuss. And I think that this is important because you should be aware of some features that are present within Fluent Validation, but we're discussing only the backend validation, and we're discussing only the manual validation. But there is an automatic validation that we are not going to discuss, and the reason behind is that you cannot use asynchronous methods there. It basically doesn't work with API controllers. It is hard to debug, and the Fluent Validator documentation says that it's basically deprecated. So the automatic validation is kind of you can kind of embed the validation inside of the ASP.NET processes, and it's the validators will be compiled and embedded into the process. And well, it's hard to unit test, it's hard to debug, and etc. It's basically deprecated. Another topic we're not going to discuss is the Blazor integration. There are libraries for the Blazor integration, and we're not going to discuss the client validation, right? Because Fluent Validation is basically used for the backend validation. But there are abilities, there are ways how you can integrate with Blazor, and how can you ways to integrate it with front end, and in particular with the Razor pages, right? Okay. So what is the value? What's wrong with the validation attributes provided by the ASP.NET by default? So the attributes, they are basically stored in the metadata, so they require a reflection, and the reflection takes some resources. It is more resource consuming. Those attributes, they are not injected, so you cannot separate them from the model. You cannot unit test it. It's very hard to implement the conditions on which those attributes should be triggered. It's hard to aggregate those attribute validators, and it's hard to pass parameters from within the action method. It's hard to control the execution of those attributes from the action method, right? And well, let's start with Fluent Validation, and I want to specifically put your attention on the basic setup, so we would understand the what we are doing when we will get to the more complex examples. So the first step, if we want to get the Fluent validation, we have to install the NuGet package. And on the right here, you can see the command that we should use to install the Fluent validation, right? So the second step, we have to introduce the class, and we should derive from the abstract validator class, which is provided by the Fluent validation libraries. And this abstract validator takes a single generic parameter, which is the model we're going to validate by using this introduced validator class, right? And on the third step, you should define a validation rule within the constructor of this class. So you see you have the constructor for the customer validator, and we have within this constructor, we are saying that we have a rule for customer, and basically we pass the model Lambda, where there is a parameter, the model, our model customer, and we specify that we want this rule to be um, uh, to be present for the surname property. Then we are calling the not null method, which is basically the validator, the default validator. And then we are calling the not equal method, which is another default validator, and we are passing the value string. So we do not want surname to be null. We do not want surname to be equal to string. Otherwise, the validation rule is going to be triggered, and we will get the error for each of the validator, right? So we have our class. And on the step 4, we have to register this class inside the dependency injection. So we go to the program class, and we say that we want to register a transient interface for the customer, and we want this interface to be implemented by the customer validator. Okay, so on the step 5, we're basically injecting this interface, and we're saying that we're calling this object as a validator, right? And on the step 6, we are calling the validate method on this validator, and we are passing the model we're going to validate, and we want to be checked. Okay, so let's switch to the code. Let's look at the code. And here within our solution, we have validators folder. And let's start with the basics of the Fluent validation. So I have this customer validator we've been speaking about. Basically, it's the class. It derives from the abstract validator for the customer model, right? So this is our class. We have a rule for customer's surname. It should not be null, and it should not be equal to string, right? And we're going to get a quick look at the controllers. So here's our validator being injected, and here we have the validator being called with the method validate. And here basically this logic is going to be repeated in every action method. So we have our validation results, and if validation results are not valid, we're going to send a bad request, and from the validation results, we're going to get errors, and we will send errors to the front end, right? Otherwise, we're sending the 200 status, and we're saying that everything is okay. Okay, then we're ready, and okay, yeah, let's take a quick look at the dependency injection, and here you can see that the service is being registered within interface, but actually we have registered only one, right? Only one particular interface for one particular validator. There are multiple options how you can register other validators, but here in this solution, I am using the method that is called add validators from assembly by containing, and I'm passing the customer validator class and saying that all of them should be transient. This is the the method from the Fluent Validation libraries, right? And basically, I'm saying that from this assembly, I'm going to register all the validators, right? And well, they are being injected in a slightly different way, but it doesn't. It isn't like connected to the topic of the Fluent validation, but well, yeah, they are registered as well. So we're going to go to our Postman, and in our Postman, you can see there is like a category Fluent Validation. We have a smoke test folder. We have a request that is called post smoke test. We have our customer controller here. We have the model we're going to pass, and we have the ID equal to 0. But actually, we're checking, if you can recall, we are checking the errors of the validator, and our customer surname should not be null and should not be equal to string, right? So here we are sending the model and we have no surname property. So we are expecting the error to be to say basically that surname should not be known. So we're sending our request, we're getting the response, and you can see that we get basically a JSON. The response says the property name surname, some problem with this property, and the error message says that surname must not be empty, right? So we have our validation error, but within the controller, we are sending back a response. There is a way to basically throw an exception when the validation is triggered. See, we have our validator, but instead we're calling, instead of just validate, we're calling validate and throw method, and we're passing the customer, right? So we're going to get an exception here. If we trigger this action method, you can try it out yourself, but I'm not going to do this right now because of the lack of time. So we have other ways to throw exception. If we go to the exception customer validator, we can see that we're basically nesting another validator. We are going to discuss this topic later. But we have our validator, and we can override the method that is called raise validation exception. And basically here we're saying that instead of the validation exception, we throw an argument exception. So by overriding this method, we can specify what is going to be thrown when we call the validate and throw method. Okay. And basically, you can make your own extension methods and do the same stuff. And you can reuse those extension methods instead of overriding the method I showed you before. Okay, so we've been discussing the default validators, and we're not going to dig into the topic of the default validators. There's nothing special about it. Like, you can validate strings, you can validate integers, and you can see that there is a class called default validators, and there's a list of them. So you can check that the value is null. You can check that the value is not null. You can check that it's empty, blah, 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 etc. You can check, like, we have a customer discount here, and this is the integer. And we can define like rules that validators that it should be less than something, greater than something, greater or equal, right, etc., etc. We have validators for email address, for enums, for regular expressions. You can use some regular expressions here, right? So there's basically this isn't something unexpected, something new, right? So the value you get from the Fluent validator is not by using the default validators, although they're useful because you can use them fast, right? The main value comes from the customization. So let's go to our customization folder. And let's look at the first topic, which is uh, conditionals for our validators. So you can see here that it's basically the validator class, and we're deriving from the same abstract validator, and we're passing our model. For the generic, we're saying that this validator will validate the customer model, right? We have our controller here. We have our rule defined for the customer discount. We're saying that it should be greater than 0, but we want this validator to be triggered only when the customer is preferred. So we're using the when method to say that the rules before, all the rules before this condition when should be triggered only if the customer is a preferred customer, right? So next we have a rule for customer discount, and we want this customer discount to be checked that it should be equal to 0 unless the customer is a preferred customer. So unless is a kind of reverse condition for the when condition, right? So taken into account those two rules, we want customer ID to be greater than 0 if the customer is a preferred customer. And we want customer discount to be equal to 0 if the customer is not a preferred customer, right? So kind of logically you can bind those two rules together logically, right? So if we have a set of rules we want to put under a single condition, we can use a when method instead of the rule for method. And we're defining the property we are defining the condition under which the rule set is going to be triggered, right? And if we want to like kind of bind together the negation of the condition, we can use the otherwise method. So when the customer is a preferred customer, we want this number of rules to be triggered. Otherwise, we want this rule to be triggered, right? And before I mentioned that before we were discussing the single condition for all the rules, we basically I said that this condition is going to be applied to all the rules before. So if we're going to have here like something like not null method, right? All those validators are going to be triggered only under this condition. So when applied to every other validator before, right? If you want to change this logic, you can pass the second parameter, which says current validator. So we have here like two validators for the photo property. We want this photo not to be empty. We want this property match the certain regular expression, and we're saying that those should be the matches. Only the matches should be applied only when the customer is a preferred customer. So this condition is only applied for the matches. Same for the empty validator. This when condition is only applied for the empty validator. It is not applied for all the previous ones, right? Because we're passing this additional parameter current validator, right? So this is what comes in regards to the conditions of the Fluent validators. So next topic is the customized validators. So we've been talking about the default validators, and you've seen that we have like something like not null, should not be equal to some value, or like should be less than, should be greater than, right? But we do not actually get some like robustness from this kind of things. We want, we can define our own logic for the validation, and we can do this pretty easily. So we have here a customized validator. I want to mention that this is the class we derive from the abstract validator. We're putting the class of our model we're going to check, right? And here's our controller. And here we say that we have a rule for the surname, and we're using the method that is called must. So the surname must be, and we're passing our own logic, our own condition. So we're saying that surname should be equal to string. Surname must be equal to string, right? And for this customized method must, we can have a second parameter, which is basically our model we're testing, and we can have the property we're testing, and we can say that the property should not be equal to the model's forename property, right? So we can define like complex conditions here. Okay, so we can see that we have properties like lists, and we can define those conditions, customized conditions, even for lists. So we're saying that the amount of items in the list should not be bigger than 10, right? Should be less than 10. And we basically can add some custom error message to each of the validator. Okay, so there is another method for customization, which is called custom. And here in this custom method, we can get the context of the validation. So we can define our own specific logic. Like we want the list count to be bigger than 10. Otherwise, we are putting into our context, we're putting failures ourselves. So we can put an error, we can put an error code in error, and you can see like we can put failure objects that are defined like even before. Using this context, we can actually pass the values from within the action method where we are calling the validator. So you can see that here we have a context, and we have a property that is called root context data. And basically, this is a dictionary. And we're checking if we have the key in this dictionary that says like should fail no matter what. And if we have this value inside our dictionary, inside our context, we're basically getting and parsing this value into the Boolean value. And if we have a Boolean value that says like that is set true for the property, like the variable that says should fail no matter what, if we should fail no matter what, to our context, we're adding the failure that says you shall not pass, right? So if we will go to our, no, let's first check out how it is wired inside the controller. So we have this logic. In the context, we're checking the value. If the value is parsed to Boolean and the Boolean is true, we're adding the error, right? So this is the logic of our validator inside the validator's controller. We're going to go to the controller that is called customized controller, customized validator. We have here our validator being created. We have this validator. We have a context. And you can see that this is the validation context class. We're passing our model we're going to test. So I have this context and there is a model within it. You can see that we have a root context data property, our dictionary, and we have a key, should fail no matter what. And we are saying that the value for this key should be true. So we have this context, we have our validator, we're calling the validate method, and we're putting the context, which already like has the model we're testing, right? So we have this validator, we have our validation results, and blah, 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 the result will be sent, right? So let's finally go to our Postman, and let's look to the folder that is called customized validator. And you can see that we have root context data request. We're setting our request to the customized controller, which is basically the customized controller we've been looking to, where we have this context being created, all right? And we'll say this model, in basically it doesn't matter what values we have here because it's going to fail no matter what. We're sending this request and we're getting the error that says you shall not pass, right? So you can customize your validators by using your own logic, by introducing like a number of failures dependent on this logic. You can even pass the parameters from the method where you call the Fluent Validator. You can make extension methods using the same old must method and passing like your custom logic. You can customize your messages, and you can do this in the number of ways. So this is the class with extension methods, right? So you can see that there are number of ways how to reuse the validators. You can use separate validators for specific properties. Like here, we're saying that we're setting the validator that is called list count validator for the orders property, right? So a number of them. I encourage you to check them out yourselves, and we can for this list we can add the default validators, so you can see those extension methods. They're basically returning some special interface, and yeah, this is the way you can customize the validators. It's much easier than validation attributes, right? And you can see this directive that says basically include, and we're passing some other validator for some other properties. Let's go and look at it, and we can see that there is a class that derives from our abstract validator, and we're putting the customer model, and we have this class, and the class has a rule for some property, and it's basically says like that there's a must method, and we're passing some specific lambda, right? So we can include rules into validators from other validators, and basically this is the nesting feature that the way how you can reuse the validators, right? Okay, so another thing we can customize is the way how we communicate with the front end. So there's a info customer validator here, and you can see that we're defining rules for the property. We're saying that we have some validator here, and we're saying that we're calling the method that is called WithSeverity, and we're passing some enum, which is equal to 1. If you look at the result, at the previous result, this JSON that we got from the Fluent validator, it has a property that is called severity, and it is equal to 0. So you can specify like what severity of the problem is going to be sent to the front end, right? This configuration doesn't influence Fluent Validator in any way. It's just a simple way to communicate with the front end. So there's another value for this severity property. You can call the method with the name WithState, and you can pass here the whole new object. You can set the ID, you can set basically any property here. This is the anonymous object. You can set properties like from with the values from the model, right? You can change the error code property. If you go to if we go here to the JSON we have the error code here, which is set basically to null, but this is because we have called our custom validator, not the default one. By the way, let's go to our smoke test and see that here we've got the result that error code was not null validator, right? So it's not always null. The default validators have their own default error codes. You can change them, and the benefit of working with those error codes is that we can have a rule for the specific property, and we can call our custom method must, and we are saying that we have some logic here, but we want to get by default we're getting the error message will be null, the error code will be null in the response JSON, right? So we can call the method that is called WithErrorCode, and we can pass this default error code name, and we're going to get the default error message for our custom validator, right? So there is a way how we can change the information and how we are communicating with the front end. Right. Okay. So the next topic, the next way to customize our validators is the rule sets. So basically, I have the same class here. We have the abstract validator, right? We have our controller. You can see here we are using the rule set method, and we're passing some rule set name. So there's a string as a name. We're passing the lambda, and within this lambda, we're enumerating the rules for this rule set. So basically here we're saying that surname should not be null, forename should not be null. And those validators, those rules, are only under the rule set that is called a names required, right? There is another rule set. We have another name for it, and we have two rules for other properties like maximum customer discount, minimum customer discount, and they should be equal or greater than to something, right? So there are two rule sets. They are separate. They are named, and we have a rule for ID, and ID should not be equal to 0. And basically, this rule is contained within the controller without any rule set. Okay, so imagine this situation. We have a post request. We're sending the new model which we're going to create within our application. So we want all the rules to be tested except the ID, right? Because we're creating the new model, and we do not care about the ID. The ID is going to be set in our database. So we want only those two rule sets to be triggered. So if we're going to go to the rule set controller, rule sets customer controller, and we're going to look at the customer post method. You can see that we have our validator here. We're calling the validate method. We're passing our model, and with that model, we're passing the lambda, where we say that the parameter is the options object. And for this options object, we're calling the method that is called include rule sets. And we are enumerating the rule sets we want to be triggered during this validation, right? So we are calling the validate method, and we're saying that the rule sets we're going to be include are such, and we are enumerating all of them, right? So if we will go to our Postman and go to our rule set folder and our rule set method, we will see that we're passing the ID that is 0, that is equal to 0. We're sending our model. We'll send it to the backend. we will look at our error, at our response with errors. You can see that we have an error here for the surname, should not be empty. We have the error for name, should not be empty. We have the error for the max customer discount, and it should be like some specific value. Property name minimum customer discount should be equal or greater to something, some specific value. We have no other errors. We have no error for our ID property, right? And this is because we enumerated what particular rule sets we are going to include. So then let's imagine that we have created our customer and we have a customer put method. We are editing this customer, and now we want let's look at the rule set validator. Now we want our ID to be included into the validation process. But say we want during the during the editing, we want to validate ID and only customer discount value. We do not care about other values. We do not care about names, right? So we're going to enumerate. Here's our validator. Here we have the put method and our validator. We're calling the validate method. We're passing our model. We're passing the Lambda with options object. Here we're calling the include rule sets method, and we're saying we are enumerating the names of the rule sets. We're saying that we want to include customer discount, and we want to include the default rules. By default, it basically means that we want to include our rules that are not in any other rule set, right? That the rules that are directly included into the into the constructor. Okay, so we have this put method and are checking for IDs included. Right, let's go to our postman. We have the put request here. You can see that our ID is equal to 0. We are sending the request, and in result, we're getting the error for the customer discount, minimum customer discount, and we are getting the error for the ID property, and ID should not be equal to 0, right? And we can see that there are no other errors. There are no errors for our names properties, right? And you can see that there is another method like customer delete, but basically we're getting the model here. Just for the sake of the example, have our validator, have our options, and on the options we're calling the method that is called include all rule sets, and it's going to include all the rules within all the rule sets and even the default rules that are directly included within the constructor, right? So, but there is a logic if you have rule sets defined within the validator, and say you have a validator and you're calling the validate method and you provide only model, you're not setting the options and you're not setting the specific rule sets, or you're not calling any other like methods on the options. You're providing just model, then only the default rule set or default rules will be executed, right? The named rule sets will not be executed if you are just providing the model and not specifying something in particular, right? So there is another way how you can decide what is going to be executed. There is a way of the specification of the properties. So here we have the specific properties validator, and you can see that we are including through the dependency injection through the factory we are asking to create a number of validators, like maybe all of the validators that I have here in this solution, and we're including them, right? So this validator is going to include like a lot of validation for like all of the properties that are present in our model. But here, for this specific validator, we have it here. We call the validate method. We have our model. We have our Lambda and options object. And we're saying that we want to include like, we want to include validation, want to include only the properties for the only validation for the customer type property. And we can specify, we can pass a string and specify that we want to include validation only for the property of the list item. So if we will go to our model, customer model, we will see that orders here is a list of orders. And we're specifying that we want to include validators for orders list, but only for the each of the total property of this list. So you can see the depth of the configuration here. So if we will execute this customer put method, we're going to get the whole model. We will check only those two properties, right? Okay, so the next topic is going to be pretty hard, pretty complex. So the topic is the cascade validation. And the idea is behind that there are several ways to configure this cascade configuration. And if you want the error, if you want the error to be sent to the result to the front end quicker and not to execute all of the rules, but to execute like first errors, then there are a number of ways to configure your Fluent validation, right? So we have like the cascade mode for the rules level. And basically it means, that we have a rule here for the surname, and we have a number of validators here, right? So the surname should not be null, it should be equal to foo, and we have a number of rules for the for a number of properties. We have like different rules, right? So if we configure the rule level cascade mode, so for each of the rule, only the first validator, only the first error will be sent. All the other validators will not be executed if the previous validator previous validation failed, right? So there is a class level cascade setup. So if there is an error within the first rule for the surname property, all the other rules are not going to be executed. We will get the error, all the errors from the surname property, but not the errors for other properties we have set, right? You can configure both of those class and rule levels. And what we will get is the fail fast strategy. So we will have the first error within our validator. So if the not null is going to be triggered for the surname property, we are not going to check all the other rules. We're going to return the first error we meet, right? So like say if the not null passes, but the next equal validator fails, we're going to get the equal to foo error, but we're not going to execute any other levels, right? So let's look at how it is actually implemented. There should be a Cascade validator. Let's look at the controller. Cascade customer controller. We have a Cascade customer validator, right? And here you can see that we have a rule for the surname. We have a number of validators for this property. We have another rule for the forename. We have the same validators here for the forename property, the same as for the surname. But here we're calling another method that is called Cascade, and we're saying that Cascade mode should stop. So let's take a quick look at our Cascade controller. Back here, we have a validator, and we're validating and passing the model, right? So it's basically nothing special here. So we will go to our folder, Cascade folder. We'll go to the post request. You can see that we're passing the empty model, so all of the errors should be triggered. And we're going to send our request. We're going to get the result, and let's look at the result. So we have the error for the surname property, and it must not be empty. We have an error for a surname, and the error says that it should not be equal to foo. It must be equal to foo, right? So I have two errors for the surname. We have an error for the forename, and it says basically forename must not be empty, and we have no other errors. Why is that? We have configured the same rules for the same rules for both of the properties, but we have here changed the cascade mode, set it to stop, right? But imagine the situation. Here's the cascade folder. Imagine the situation where you have like rules for a number of properties, and you're specifying the cascade mode stop for every property, right? It's tedious. You can just set the rule level cascade mode for property to stop for the abstract validator base class. And all of those rules are going to execute, they're going to send the errors only on the first validator, right? So if the not null fails, equal will not be executed for each of the rule in this validator, right? Let's check it out. So we have our put method, which is basically doing the same, sending the empty object, right? It's using this rule level rule level cascade setup. And we see that we have surname error, and it should not be empty, right? We have forename property, and forename should not be empty. We have a credit card name, and credit card name should not be empty. We have no other errors that are saying that those properties should be equal to foo. Although we have this configuration here for each of the properties, right? So there's another configuration for the cascade mode, which is called class level cascade mode. So the class level basically says that if one of the rules fails, all the next levels are not going to be executed, right? So if we will get the error, say for the forename property, the validator for the credit card is not going to be executed. So let's try it out. There's another method. This is the method for the cascade class level setup. We're setting the empty model, and we're getting the response. We have the error for the surname. It must not be empty. The error for the surname. Surname must be equal to foo. And we have no other errors. This is because we got the errors for the first rule. We've got the error for the one of the rules, and all the other rules are not executed, right? So yeah, this is how the class level cascade customer. This is how the class level mode is set up. And if you want to get the fail fast strategy, if you want to get the first error from the first, like if you want to get a single error that you have like met during the validation and no other rules executed, you can combine both of those two setups. So say you're going to say that the class level cascade mode is set to stop and the rule level cascade mode is also set to stop, right? And if you want any of this logic to be implemented in your whole solution, then you can set up the specific properties within your program. You can use the static class that is called validator options, right? And there's a default class level cascade mode, and there's a default rule cascade mode properties here. And you can set them to stop, set them both to stop, right? So there is another option of the configuration, right? So the next important topic, let's go back to our validators, and here we have the asynchronous validators. So you see that there's our class. It derives from the abstract validator, and we send the model, right? And here within the class constructor, we are injecting some client. And this client is going to asynchronously get us some values. Basically, if you go to this client, it is actually a stop. It checks that if the ID exists, right? We're putting some ID and it's waiting for some period of time, like stubbing some asynchronous request, right? And it's basically says that sends true all the time. And well, for every parameter, it basically says that for every ID, it basically says that every ID exists. So here in our asynchronous validator, we have rule sets, right? And for those rule sets, we have within those rule sets we have rules for specific properties. So say we have a rule for the customer ID. And here we're calling the must async method, and we're passing the asynchronous lambda here. We're passing the property value and the cancellation token. Here within this custom logic, we're asking the client whether the ID exists. And if the ID exists, we're basically saying the opposite of the value. So if the ID exists and is true, we're responding with false. And this basically means that this rule failed, right? So the result of this rule is going to false. And if the rule fails, we're going to get the ID must be unique error message, right? So let's go to our Postman, and here we have the asynchronous validators folder. And here we have the post methods, method, and here we are sending the ID that is equal to -10, but it doesn't actually matter because we have the stop that's going to fail anyway, right? So we had some delay in the request response. And here we have the property name ID. And the error message says that ID must be unique, right? So we've got this error message that we expected, right? There is another rule for the surname, and we have a method that is called custom async. And here within this custom async, we're passing into the Lambda, the synchronous Lambda. We have our cancellation token, we have our model, but we here have a context. And if you remember, we can do much more funny stuff with the context, right? So we're asking our client if blah, blah, blah. We're doing it asynchronously, we're getting some value, and based on this value, we're taking our context and adding some error to it. If you can recall, we can also, using this context, we can pass some value from the method where we are executing our validator, right? And the another interesting thing for the context is that we have the instance to validate property, which you can see is basically our model, right? And here we're saying that we're getting the context and we're getting the model and we're referring to the ID property, right? Although we have like the rule set for the surname, we are getting the value of another value of the model. We're getting the model itself. We can add specific properties. We can add several properties. We can get some values that are passed from the method where we execute the validator itself. So you can see that customer async is like covers pretty everything, right? There is another asynchronous method for the Fluent validator. You can see that we have a rule for the surname. And we have some validator here, default validator that says that surname should not be equal to string. And we have here the asynchronous condition when. So we want this validator to be executed only when, and the condition here is asynchronous, and we're sending the request to some asynchronous client, right? Or it could be a database repository, et cetera, right? So based on this value, we're saying that blah, 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 whether this condition should be applied to this, whether this validator should be applied to the property, like, and the condition is asynchronous, right? Okay, so the next topic is the localization. So here we have our validator. It derives from the abstract validator. We're passing the model type, right? Here's our constructor, and into the constructor, we are passing the interface for the string localizer. We're passing uh, the uh, the type of our class itself. So we are basically saying to the ASP.NET, this interface iString localizer is the default ASP.NET code. This is the default localization interface. We're saying that we want a specific localizer for a specific for this particular class, right? And we have here the localizer object. So yeah, we have it. So we have here we have a rule for the for name. We're saying it should not be equal to string. We have another rule for the surname. We're saying that it should not be equal to string. Here we're calling the with name method, and we're passing some value from the localizer, right? I'll ask you to remember this with name method. Okay, so let's go to our front end and test the localization. So we have here the default localization member. So here you can see that for the surname and forename, we have a string value and the validation should be triggered. All right, we're sending the request. We're getting our errors for the forename, and forename must not be equal to string, and surname must not be equal to string, right? But where's the localization? There is no localization parameter being passed here, so we got the default language, and the default language is set to English, right? So let's go to another request. Here you see that we have the same localization customer controller. We have a parameter though, and the parameter says that we want a Norwegian culture with Norwegian language. You can see that in our request we have the surname, forename, and they are both equal to strings, so the validation errors are going to be triggered. You can see that the property name forename has their message and basically says something in Norwegian, not in English. So here we have a Norwegian part in the Norwegian language, And this part is provided by the Fluent Validation default languages. So we have set the culture of our request to Norwegian, and the Fluent Validation automatically translated it to the Norwegian language, right? But we have a small problem here, because the for name is the name or property, right? You see here the property is for name. We specify the rule for this property, but it isn't translated to Norwegian language, right? So here we have another error for the property name surname. And here you can see the same error. Basically, it's saying that the value should not be equal to string, but in Norwegian language. But here we have our surname translated into Norwegian as well, right? So how we achieved that? So this was achieved by calling the withName property, and we have set the localizer here. We have passed the localizer here, right? And how localizer understood that it's going to set the Norwegian value? Well, basically, we had the culture specified in our request. And if you go to the resources folder in our solution, you can see that there is a validators folder. And within this validators folder, there are two RESX files. So the first one is the default English language. So the first for the surname key, we have the surname value. For the in another file that is called the localization customer validator .nb hyphen no, which is Norwegian culture. You can see that there's a key for the surname and the value is in Norwegian, right? So this is how localization done. And this logic does not come by default. You should specify, you should configure the ASP.NET localization to be ready to search the localization files in the specified directory, right? So here's the resources, and here's the resources folder. You should also configure the supported languages, supported cultures, and you should set the default culture, right? But this is the logic applied for the ASP.NET. This is not Fluent Validator logic. So yeah, the moral of the story is that you can inject the localization, the default localizer of the ASP.NET, and you can use the localization files within your validators, right? Okay, so the last but not least topic. Oh, by the way, there are other things, like there are more complex topics, like imagine you have a model that is this is the person model, and we have a property here, and the property type is actually the interface, and you can see that there's a list of interfaces, and we have our address, right? So within our address interface, we have a couple of properties like address 1, address 2, nothing special, right? But imagine that we have like a physical address that derives from the interface, and we have those two properties, but we have a special property for a physical address, which is zip code, right? And we have another model that is actually derives from the I address. This is the virtual address, derives from the I address. It has like both those properties from the interface, but the special property is the date, time, and it is called expires, right? So they're the physical and the virtual address are basically like different implementations of those of this interface. So how do you validate that, right? So we have a rule for addresses property, which is I address. And we're calling the set inheritance validator method here. And we're passing like validators for both of those types, and we are passing the specific validators. Like here's a physical address validator, and you can see that this is the validator for the specific physical address, and we're checking we have some rules for the zip code property here, right? And we're saying that like for this type, we have this validator. But for the virtual address, we have virtual address validator. If you go here, you can see that there is a rule for the expires property, and it's a datetime value. And you can see that this abstract validator is built for the virtual address model, right? So Fluent Validation covers this case as well. Okay, there's another option how you can use the Fluent Validation. There's a method that is called PreValidate. You can override that, and it's going to be executed before any of the rules within the constructor of the validator, right? So here within this pre-validate rule, so it's going to be executed before. We're checking if we're referring to the context. We have our model, we have our ID, and we're checking whether it's equal to 0, right? And if it's so, like we're failing we're failing the validation of the model. We're saying that the validation is failed, and none of the rules are going to be executed if the pre-validate method was triggered and basically the validation here failed. Okay, right? So those are another like complex topics how you can customize your validators. Okay, so the last topic for today is going to be the unit testing. And for unit testing, as you have seen, we are injecting our validators into the controllers. And you can remember this simple controller. Basically, we were injecting the iValidator for customer here in the beginning, right? And we registered that this interface should be resolved with the customer validator, our first smoke test. But here we have a test for our customer controller. You can see that this customer controller is the system under test. And instead of injecting the actual validator, we're using something that is called inline validator. And we're saying that it's going to validate the customer. So basically, this is the mock object from the Fluent Validation libraries, right? So how do we use it? Here's our test. Here's our model being arranged. Here we are arranging this mock object. So we're saying that there's a rule for the surname, and the surname should not be null. And basically, we're executing our system under test, whereas since we're calling the customer method and sending the customer model here, we're getting some result, and we are asserting that the result is the bad request. So basically, we have configured our validator to fail. We've set the model to match the unmatch, or like it's better to say unmatch the validator rule, right? The model doesn't match the rule. So the result we're getting is actually the bad request. So we have tested that our controller, that if validator fails, we're getting the bad request type of object, right? So we have used the injection. Okay, so let's look at other examples. We have here the asynchronous customer validator, and you can see that we have a client here. Well, basically, I'm using here the same stub object, but we have the validator, asynchronous validator, and we are injecting this client. So, well, basically, in this unit test, it could be anything, right? And we're setting up. If you can recall, then that in asynchronous validator, we had not just rules, but those rules are wrapped in the rule sets, right? So here in this test method, we are calling our validators method that has name test validate async. So we are passing our model, and we're saying that the options we're passing the lambda, and we have the options object here. And on this options object, we're saying that we're going to include the specific rule sets, right? And this specific rule set is the must async rule set, right? So if you go here, you can see that this rule set has the name must async. So that particular rule is going to be triggered, right? So we have we have the test validate method, but here we're using test validate async. You can see that for the result we will get, there are like assert specific assert messages that says that we have should have like some particular error with some particular error message, right? So there are libraries in the Fluent validation for testing, specific methods for testing, right? Let's look at other examples. So here you can see that system under test is the validator for the collections, right? And here we are injecting some other validator, and we have some rules. So like, yeah, we have the dependency, and we are setting it to particular class, right? But you can substitute this in unit test to any stub you want, right? To the same old inline validator, mock object, or something else. So you can see that here we're calling the test validate method on the system under test. And we have a result, and we have, because we're calling this test validate method, we're getting the test validation result object. And for this object, we have the specific, like the specific methods for testing. So here we say that the result should not have validation error for the surname property, right? There is a bunch of them. You can see that we can configure that this result should not have validation error for, and we're saying that there should not be error for the total property of the first element of the orders list, right? So you can specify other validation methods. So I encourage you to look at them yourself. And yeah, there's a bunch of them. And well, another topic, it's probably not as complicated. Well, basically, if you have a validator, if you have an inline validator here, and you have some controller, and you are passing this inline validator as dependency, you can specify the rule set on this inline validator, and you can specify some specific rule within this rule set, and you can pass this dependency into your system under test, and well, you're calling the method and you're getting some result, and you can assert this result that this is the bad request, right? So you can test both. You can test the validators themselves, and you can test the classes where you inject the validators, right? So highly testable, easy to configure, a lot of value, and I encourage you to look at the solution that you can find in the GitHub, and here's the link to the repository. I'm going to add the link into description to this video. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope you find this video valuable, and bye-bye.